in our nuggets so far in this course, we've had a lot of exposure to the NetScaler, how to install it, get it up and running, the basic components. We've even load balanced across red, green, and blue servers. However, it occurred to me that we probably in a production environment are not going to be load balancing across red, green, and blue. In fact, many environments where we're using virtualization from Citrix, it is very likely we're going to want to be doing some load balancing with Citrix devices. For example, let's say we have a user that's internal to the company. They're not on the outside untrusted world. Do we need a NetScaler? And the answer is, in a small environment, possibly not. However, in a large environment where we have fault tolerance involved, we may want to do load balancing across our storefront servers. So for example, if we have 2 storefront servers in our Zen Desktop, Zen App environment, we could put our NetScaler right here, so we could do load balancing between our users who are internal and multiple storefront servers. And the process we have already been through. We would identify our servers, in this case they'd be the storefront servers. We would create a service that represents the service being provided by those storefront servers, and for the monitor, we would use the special monitor type called Storefront. And then we would create a load balancing virtual server, give it an IP address of VIP, and have our users connect to that VIP. Very likely that would be done through DNS. So the user, using either the web interface or the native receiver, they would connect to that VIP, and then they would be load balanced to one of the 2 storefront servers. And we could set up persistence based on a source IP, so that when the user connects to a specific storefront server, they would continue to connect to that same storefront server. And in the background, there is some synchronization work that does go on between the storefront servers. And as administrators, if we made changes to one storefront, we would want to replicate those changes to the other storefront server as well. Now, for those of you who worked in an older Zen Desktop, Zen App environment, this used to be called Web Interface. In fact, it's a different product that replaces Web Interface. This feature called Storefront. And then once Bob connects to the storefront server and authenticates, based on what he's been authorized to use, which could include virtualized desktops, if he wants to open a virtual desktop or specific apps, and Storefront is going to give that user a menu to choose from. So he can select from what he's allowed to use, he can select those and then start to run those virtual desktops or apps as he desires. Now in the background, there are some servers providing those resources. We may have VDI hosts. VDI stands for Virtual Desktop Infrastructure. And those could be either virtual machines or physical machines that the user are going to be getting their virtual desktops from. Or if Bob is going after an app through the storefront, that app is very likely being served up through some type of an RDS host. RDS is a Microsoft term for remote desktop services. A long, long time ago, in a galaxy far away, they called that terminal services, but now it's RDS services. And this guy here in the middle, the delivery controller, is the command center for making all those connections happen between the services the user wants and selecting through Storefront and the back-end resources that are providing that functionality. So you can kind of think of it like air traffic control. It's the function, the delivery controller is the function inside of a Zen App, Zen Desktop environment that's directing the traffic to the right locations. And that's based on who is requesting services and then where those services are on the back end. So getting back to our focus here, we could put in a load balancer between the user and the storefront servers for that load balancing. So for the demonstration portion in this nugget, here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to take Bob, who's a happy user, and give you an example of what it looks like for Bob to connect to Storefront locally without a NetScaler. So from Bob's computer, we could use the receiver that's installed on Bob's computer, or we could use the web URL to reach the store. So we'll do that first. And then secondly, we'll put a NetScaler right here, that'll be number 2, between Bob and the storefront server or servers. And that'll give us a good review of creating a load balancing virtual server for the storefront servers that we're going to be load balancing for, and creating a service linked to the storefront monitor, which is keeping track of the server, in this case, which is going to be our storefront server. Here in Zen Desktop and Zen App, I'm opening up Studio. And in Studio, that's where we identify resources that are available on the back end. These resources could include full virtual machines or hosted applications. And in the language of Citrix, the machine catalog identifies the resources that are available to be delivered. And we can kind of think of this like the back-end kitchen, like what can actually be cooked up and provided and served up in the restaurant or in the environment. And the delivery group, I like to think of that as the menu of what the users can pick from. So in my lab environment, I quickly set up a machine catalog with a resource that could be used. I used a Windows 2012 server running remote desktop services. And then I created a delivery group that could put those applications from the RDS host on the menu. The applications that are currently set up to be delivered that can be consumed by a customer are Calculator, Notepad, and WordPad. And for more training on the back end of Zen Desktop and Zen App, please come and check us out for the Zen App and Zen Desktop courses right here at CBT Nuggets. But for now, I just wanted to let you know that these resources are currently set up in my lab environment. I also have here the management console for managing the store. So currently I have one store set up. It's called Vegas. And if we go to the receiver for web portion of the Citrix storefront, right here it's saying that the website URL to get access to the store is http://cs1.nuglab.local/citrix/vegasweb. So if a user, like Bob, went to that URL, he would be connecting to this storefront server. So before we put a NetScaler between the user and the storefront server, let's do a basic check to make sure a user on the internal network can connect to the storefront server and get access to those resources being served up by the Zen Desktop Zen App environment. So here on a computer on the local network, I'm putting in cs-1.nuglab.local/citrix/vegasweb, and sure enough, I'm now connected to Storefront, and it's asking me to authenticate. So we'll authenticate as Bob, and we'll supply Bob's password. We're a member of nuglab.local, and we'll click Log On. So with us logged in as Bob, let's click on the plus symbol. There's the link for all apps, and there's Calculator, Notepad, and WordPad. So let's bring Calculator to our desktop and WordPad, and what the heck, we'll bring Notepad too. So now we have these three apps that are available. In fact, we really don't need WordPad and Notepad. Let's get rid of Notepad by just removing it. We can always go back later and add it to the desktop here if we want. And then just to verify it works, let's go ahead and launch Calculator. And it brings up Calculator. So this application of Calculator is really running on the RDS host, simply being displayed here on my computer. So if I can calculate, for example, 6783 minus 555 equals, there we go. And as a user, I really don't care if this is running locally on my computer or if it's running on some remote server. I'm just a consumer of the app. And our purpose here was just to verify that the storefront was working for Bob the user without going through any kind of load balancer. And we'll go ahead and log Bob off. So he's no longer connected to the storefront server. Next, what we'll do is we'll put a little load balancing right in between the user Bob and the storefronts. So for this demonstration, Bob's computer is going to be sitting on the 23.1.2.0 network. The storefront server itself is going to be on the 192.168.1 network. And what we'll do is we'll create a load balancing virtual server. We'll give it the VIP address of .50. And we could make one for HTTP or HTTPS. We've already taken a look at how to do SSL offload in a previous nugget. And on the NetScaler, we would define our servers, which would be our storefront servers. And we'd set up a service and monitor. In this case, it would be a storefront monitor to track and verify the storefront server or servers are up and running. And when we're done, we can verify it's working by having Bob connect to that virtual IP address and verify that he still has access to those back-end storefront servers through the load balancer. So here on the NetScaler, let's do a couple of basic things. Number one, we'll open up the traffic management section for load balancing, expand the load balancing section, and let's start off with our servers. We need to identify at least one storefront server, and if we want to load balance, possibly two. So we'll click on Add to add a server, and we'll call it Storefront Server. The IP address is 192.168.1.115 in my lab environment, and we'll click on Create. So great, we've got a storefront server. Next, we'll go to monitors, and we've already got a monitor that we created earlier in this course. So we could go ahead and use that, or we could create a new monitor. So let's take a look at the details of this monitor. I'm going to right-click and select Edit for that monitor just to take a look at it. And for this monitor, I'm not going to tell it to use the storefront account service, and the store is actually called Vegas, so I'm going to put that in here as well, and then click on OK. So now our monitor called Monitor-Storefront is ready to go. Next, let's create a service object. So there's our three services for red, green, and blue. Let's click on Add to add a new service. We'll call it Storefront Service. And because we already defined the server, we can just select it from the drop-down list here. And on the back end, I also happen to be using HTTP for access to that storefront server. In a secure environment, you very well may have a digital certificate on that storefront server and are using SSL as opposed to HTTP. So you'd want to put the correct protocol for what you're using with that storefront server here and click on OK. Now we're not quite done with the service because we need to tell the service to use the monitor to keep track of whether or not that service is really up. So we'll scroll down just a little bit to monitors. It says it has one service to load balancing monitor binding already set up. That's the default monitor called TCP-default. We want to replace that with our storefront monitor. We'll click on Add Binding. We'll select our monitor from the list by clicking this box. Scrolling down, and there's our monitor-storefront monitor. We'll select it and click on OK. And then we'll click on Bind. And we'll click on Close. And then we'll click on Done. Now, we're hoping for a green indicator here to indicate that it's up and running. However, we want to make sure that it's really up. So after a few seconds, we might want to click this refresh button just to make sure that it really is up. And it looks like it's still up. That's great news. And if we had a second storefront server, we'd also set up a second storefront service for monitoring that second server as well. Just as we did with our red, green, and blue servers, we could have multiple storefront servers all being available to a virtual load balancing server that we're about to create. And that leads us to our final step, going up to virtual servers under load balancing, and we'll click on Add, and let's call this load balancing virtual server for storefront. Now, regarding connecting to this virtual server, if we want a secure connection from the user to the load balancer, of course we'd use SSL, which involves making sure the virtual server has a digital certificate associated with it. And we've already walked through the process of doing SSL offload and implementing a digital certificate on a load balancing virtual server in previous nuggets in this course. So that's just icing on the cake if you want to add that as well as you load balance connections over to storefront servers. In my lab environment, I'm just going to use HTTP so I don't have to worry about digital certificates and URLs that exactly match those certificates. And the virtual IP address that we're going to use is 23.1.2.50 for this load balancing virtual server. And we'll click on OK. Then we'll click here where it says, hey, there's no current services bound to this virtual server. So we'll click here. From the drop down, we'll go ahead and click on the storefront service, click OK. And we could add additional services for additional storefront servers. Now in our case, I've only set up one. So we're only going to bind one service to this virtual server. We'll click on OK. We'll click on Done. And it says that the load balance virtual storefront is down down. Let's do a refresh and hope for the best. And look at that. Okay, now it's up. That's great. Now the reason it's up is because the services that are bound to this load balancing virtual server are also up. So our next step is to go ahead and test this. And to test it, we'll get Bob, our good buddy Bob, to connect to the VIP address, which is the .50 address. And if we had DNS set up, we could have, for example, storefront.acme.com be mapped to that address. And that would be the load balancing virtual server address on the NetScaler, which would then proxy Bob's request over to our storefront server or servers if we're doing load balancing. So let's go ahead and do that right now. All right, my friend, here we go. So the first thing I want to do real quick is from a command prompt, let's just verify that we have reachability to the virtual IP address of the NetScaler load balancing virtual server, which is the .50 address. Let's do a ping of 23.1.2.50. That's great. Let's also test our name resolution. We'll do a ping to storefront.acme.com. And that also should resolve to 23.1.2.50. Now that we know that DNS maps storefront.acme.com over to 23.1.2.50, which is the virtual IP address on the NetScaler gateway for the load balancing virtual server that's doing the load balancing for the storefronts, let's go ahead and open up a browser to that IP address. So we'll open up Chrome. And on Chrome, what we're going to do is we are going to go to http://storefront.acme.com/ and the URL for the storefront server on the server itself was Citrix/VegasWeb, just like that. So I've got a message that says I need to allow these Citrix plugins, so I will do that. I'll come up here, and I'll simply say, please always allow plugins on storefront.acme.com. I'll click on Done. And now Storefront is asking us to log on. We are now being proxied through the NetScaler going to the storefront server. And if we had two storefront servers, we would be load balanced to one of those storefront servers. So let's log in as Bob. We'll put in Bob's password. And the domain that Bob's authenticating through is nuglab.local. So let me make this actually a little bit bigger so we can see it better. So I have Bob's username, his password, the domain that he's a member of, and we'll click on Log On. And there's some resources that Bob has access to. And if we wanted to add more, we can come over here and let's grab the notepad as well. So if we wanted to launch one of these, let's go ahead and launch WordPad this time. We launched Calculator before. And lo and behold, there's WordPad. And the cool thing is, if we went to Task Manager right here, brought up Task Manager and said, hey, what's running on this computer? You notice it does not say that WordPad is running because WordPad is being delivered from an RDS host. It's an application being delivered through Zen Desktop. And our connection that we're using from the receiver on Bob's client over to those services, it's using an HDX connection. In old terms, that would be called an ICA connection, but the terminology and the technology is changing. So currently it's called an HDX connection. And that's what we see here, the Citrix HDX engine with that WordPad being run from a remote location. And that, my friend, is very fun stuff. You know, one other thing that we might want to change, and we probably should have done it when we set up the virtual server, is the persistence. So let's grab our load balancing virtual server for Storefront. We'll edit it. On the right-hand side, we'll grab persistence to bring it over to the left. And for persistence, let's go ahead and base it on source IP address. Now, in our case, we only have one Storefront server that we're load balancing with. But if we were doing load balancing for multiple Storefront servers, this would assist us in keeping Bob on the same Storefront server. So with that selected, I'm going to go ahead and click on OK and click on Done. So we're also going to want to save our configuration. So we'd click on the floppy icon and click on Yes to save our configuration. In this nugget, we've applied the NetScaler as a load balancer between a client with the receiver who wants access to a Storefront server. I've had a lot of fun in this nugget. I'm glad that you joined me for it. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.